Hello and welcome to the latest in the live Truth According to interviews. Today I'm joined by Clare Algar of Reprieve, who will talk to us about detention without trial, abuses of counter-terrorism and death penalties. If you have any questions, you can comment on the site or tweet us at Truthloader. Thank you very much for coming to the studio again today, Clare. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about Reprieve and the work that you do?
Yes. We are a bunch of legal ninjas, and we work on extreme human rights. So we represent people who are facing the death penalty, and we represent people who have been victims of the war on terror. So guys in Guantanamo and people who've been the victim of drone strikes, or who are currently living under drone strikes. We're based in London. We've got 35 people. We travel a lot, as you can imagine. And yeah, it's a pretty awesome place.
And can I ask you a bit about yourself, about how you got involved?
Yeah, it's a funny story. So about 100 years ago when I left college, I heard my current boss, Clive Stafford-Smith, on the radio talking about one of his death penalty cases in Louisiana. And I thought he sounded awesome. And so I wrote to him. And I said, can I come and make your tea and do your photocopying and so forth? I didn't hear from him for months. I realized when I got out there that the office was quite kind of all over the place. Anyway, he finally called me, and it was like 3 in the morning or something because of the time difference between Louisiana and London. And he was like, yes, come, that's a great idea. So I did. I jumped on a plane and went and worked with him for about a year in Louisiana. And it was amazing. It was just awesome. I lived in New Orleans, and there was amazing music and amazing food, and there was this awesome work which involved, I was 20, and I was kind of going into death rows in Mississippi and Louisiana. And because I was there for quite a long time, I had a pretty awesome project, which was basically everyone who was on death row at that time got a lawyer for their trial and a lawyer for their appeal, but after that they weren't entitled to a lawyer. The state didn't pay for them to have a lawyer. And so I was working on a project to try to prove that they were unable to defend themselves. So it basically involved me meeting with everyone on death row in Mississippi, which was just amazing. So anyway, I did that. And then I came back to London, and I did a training contract as a lawyer. I ended up working at a corporate firm for 10 years, which was very different and a bit of a culture shock. And I guess it was always there. I was always kind of thinking, not really saving the world doing this very much. I really liked working at my law firm. They were lovely, and the clients I had were great, but I was working for a kind of oil and gas company and an airline, and you're kind of like, well, it's not really the little guy. And then what happened? Then I was watching The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. You see how media very important in the world. And yeah, I was watching, and this awful guy called William Crystal came on, and he was talking about how important it was for the US to use torture as one of the weapons in the war on terror. And it just really irritated me. And I knew that Clive was doing some Guantanamo work, so I called him up and I said, this is outrageous. What are you doing about it? And in a rather irritating Socratic way, he said, it is outrageous, Claire. What are you doing about it? I was like, yeah. Anyway, he said, why didn't I come and run his charity? And I was like, I'm an intellectual property litigator. I don't know anything about NGOs or managing people or fundraising or bookkeeping or, any of those things that ideally you should know if you run a charity. And he was like, yeah, you'll pick all that up. Which is extremely, I'm very grateful to him because, I've been there 6 years now. And, it's awesome. And it's a great place to get up to and go to work in the morning.
You mentioned Guantanamo. That's one of your main places that you visit, isn't it?
Yeah. We're doing some cool stuff at Guantanamo at the moment, actually. I mean, obviously, it's still open. So the first thing I should say, it's still open, because I go to kind of parties and lunches and things, and I say what I do, and people are like, Guantanamo, that didn't President Obama close that? Like, no, he did not. Anyway, he said he was going to. 2009, first executive order, we will close Guantanamo. Here we are, 2014. I feel a bit like a kind of battered wife about this, because I sort of go, maybe he's going to change. Maybe this time he's going to do what he said. You know, when he came in, we had this big party, and all of our funders called up and were like, "Do we still need to fund you?" And I sort of, well, let's just see how it goes. And then
5 years later,
right? Well, and then his second term, I was kind of like, well, maybe it's now that it's his second term and he doesn't have to be re-elected. Maybe now he'll close it. And then people are sort of saying, well, maybe towards the end of his second term. And you're just like, maybe, or just anyway. The cool stuff we're doing on Guantanamo at the moment is, so there are 149 people in Gitmo at the moment, of whom 79 are cleared for release. And the problem with having clients who have no due process at all is that they sort of fall into despair, I guess, to an even greater degree than if you have a kind of appeal that's coming up, or a trial that's coming up, or anything that they can look forward to. Because, you know, if you're cleared for release and you still don't leave, it feels like there's just nothing that can be done for you. So a lot of the clients, a lot of the folk in Gitmo now are hunger striking, which is obviously a very extreme protest, but it's really the only thing they feel that they have left. And, you know, hunger striking is a recognized form of protest for prisoners. It's recognized by the UN and so forth, and unfortunately the administration's response to it has been a very aggressive process of force feeding, and needlessly aggressive, you know, in that they sort of pull the tubes out after each force feed and re-intubate each new force feed, and the forcible cell extraction teams that come and take the guys from their cells generally beat them up, and it's just very unpleasant. You know, there's a guy who has a wheelchair because well, he needs a wheelchair, and there's a rule that says that prisoners have to walk to be force-fed, and he clearly can't walk to be force-fed because he needs a wheelchair, and they've said, no, if you can't walk to be force-fed, we're going to forcible cell, you know, extract you with the extraction team. It's just unnecessary. Anyway, so we brought a piece of litigation on behalf of one of the hunger strikers, saying that he had the right to hunger strike and that the administration didn't have the right to force feed him. It was completely hopeless piece of litigation. Quite a lot of Reprieve's litigation, I should tell you, is when we bring it, has very little chance of success, kind of by definition. But one of the great things about litigation is that it brings out facts that are otherwise secret, and it exposes those facts to the world, because the media is obviously very interested in these areas, and so you bring these pieces of litigation, and very often the media will cover it, and so you will get, as well as fighting in the courts of law, you can fight in the court of public opinion. Anyway, in this piece of litigation, a very cool thing happened, in that it transpired that the administration had been videoing the force feeding for training purposes, right? So yeah, right, and and it's this sort of thing that's extraordinary. So we didn't foresee this happening, but we now have, I think, 17
evidence.
tapes. Yeah, 17 tapes of hours of this guy being force-fed horribly, and that's classified. It's so I can't see it. I'm not security cleared. I'm not an American citizen, but
I was going to ask who is security cleared.
Yeah, Americans.
Okay.
but we have several people on our staff team who are security cleared, and they have seen these tapes, and they're apparently distressing. I think they can sort of say that without letting too many cats out of bags. And I think that if we could get these tapes into the public domain, there could be an Abu Ghraib moment, I guess, around Guantanamo, in that I think that if Americans saw what was happening in Guantanamo right now, not under Bush, but under Obama, obviously under an American administration who are controlling the camp, even if the camp itself isn't in America, there would be a public outcry. And so we've invited a bunch of US broadcasters to intervene in the litigation, and they've done that. All of them, you'll be stunned to hear, except for Fox News, have intervened and have asked for the tapes. And so, you know, that's ongoing, but if they were successful in that, and it's a kind of freedom of speech issue for them, which obviously is quite big in America, so there's even a possibility they might get that stuff. So that would be awesome, and could be, I think, would be quite a Reprieve moment, in that it would be using litigation, and, you know, the litigation is useful in and of itself, but also using litigation to get that information into the public sphere in a way that will hopefully transform the debate.
Do you think that could close the prison?
I think if the tapes were to come out, there would be an enormous amount of focus on the prison. I mean, the thing that you realize with issues like Guantanamo is that it's never going to close if there isn't a lot of focus on it.
Yes.
You know, for years it just went out of the public spotlight altogether because Obama was in, because he'd said he was going to close it. I think that somehow it just sort of fell out of the spotlight, and we continued to try to do litigation work, but it became more and more difficult in the US just because many of the, you know, there's a national security defense which just cuts off any piece of litigation you bring. But as soon as you start getting the spotlight on it, politicians start looking at it again. So we brought out a great thing that your viewers should go and look at, which is the musician Mos Def allowed himself to be force-fed. I know it's not pleasant viewing, but he allowed himself to be intubated, and we in The Guardian published that, and it got, I think, 10 million hits in a reasonably short space of time. And that, in conjunction with the piece of litigation that we brought in the US, this force-feeding litigation, caused a bunch of senators to write to Obama and say, what are you doing about this stuff? And
that's the powerful things you need.
Right, and he then reopened the office to look at closing Guantanamo, which rather depressingly had been closed. So you know, yeah, I mean, I think that shining the spotlight on things like Guantanamo is the only way it will end up.
And there's not that, I think you said it was 150 people there, are there?
Yeah,
and 79 with release. It's not that many, and it's a relatively new prison as well, is it?
Yeah, 800 people have gone through it in total, since it's been open recently, of whom 600 have been released without charge. As I say, many of the people who are still there are detained without charge.
What crimes are they there for? Are we talking about?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that all of them are innocent, but a surprising number of them have been. Most of the crimes, there are some people who are there. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who are charged with being involved in 9/11 and the plotting of that. A lot of people who are there are charged with significantly lesser crimes, such as attending a training camp or what have you. But they're all charged, well, not charged, alleged to have committed some crime relating to terror. But the problem is that the thing that we have found in representing these guys for a long time is that the evidence that stuff is based on is usually not great. The intelligence is not great. So we've had lots of cases of mistaken identity, of two people's names being similar and people being confused. And another thing which has been really difficult is that one of the ways in which the Americans got a lot of the guys who are in Guantanamo was by offering a bounty. And so they said, you know, we will give $5,000 if people in rural Afghanistan give us Al-Qaeda. Yeah. And the problem is, and that went up to £250,000 to £500,000
millions
to several
for Obama.
It was several millions. And the problem is that if you're offering that kind of money to people, well, to anyone actually, but especially to people in very poor areas, they're pretty soon going to find people who are Al-Qaeda, whether they are actually Al-Qaeda or not. You know, if there's someone who's looked at your wife funny, or someone with whom you have a boundary dispute, or what have you, and you get to say, this guy helped, was I don't know, Osama's driver or something, then you get a large amount of money, and that inconvenient person gets removed from your life, and that does seem to have happened with quite a few of the guys that we've been representing. I could tell you more and more stories, but I should probably move on to other bits of the work that we do. But yeah,
of course. I just had a couple more questions about it. If you're sent there, are you basically going to be there for life, and you look after people who can't afford it? Is that how it works, or who can't get legal representation?
Yeah, we don't exactly. So we don't charge anyone for any of the work that we do, and generally the people whom we represent are people who couldn't afford representation otherwise. So, for example, we were asked to represent. Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, and we didn't because there were many other lawyers who were willing to represent him. I think he could afford representation elsewhere. In terms of whether people are going to stay in Guantanamo forever, I mean, I think the reason that they're hunger striking is just because it's really unclear. It's unclear what's going to happen with the prison. Obama has still pledged to close it. I've seen him occasionally on television revisiting that pledge and saying that he feels bad about the fact that it hasn't closed. A lot of people who are cleared for release can't go, in part because it's difficult to find countries resettlement countries, so countries where they can go to, because the US refuses to have anyone resettled on US land. So yeah, it's very unclear how that will be handled.
What are the facilities like bad there, or are they average? Is given methods of torture?
They're not good. There are still stories of. I mean, I think bits of it have definitely improved. It very much depends on who is in charge of the prison at any given time. I think the person in charge of it at the moment is not being terribly enlightened. There are still stories of the Quran being desecrated, and just things that are going to be upsetting to people who are in there. And also there's the force feeding, which I think is the main issue. And we had a client who has been hunger striking for a very long time, and the last time our lawyer went to see him, she had to conduct the interview with him lying down because he didn't actually have the physical strength to sit up because of the hunger striking. So the conditions are not good.
Oh, it's terrible. Then another one I was going to say was, where do you get funded then?
It's a very good question.
Yes.
Possibly by your wonderful viewers, if anyone's feeling philanthropic. Our funding, about half of our funding comes from trusts and foundations. Basically, there are lots and lots of foundations in the world which have different sort of interests. So there are some that are interested in education, some that want to give money out to help relieve poverty, some of them fabulous ones that want to work in areas with human rights. And so about 60% of our funding comes from that. Then we get a grant from the European Commission for our death penalty work, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then the rest of our funding comes from individuals, either people who give us sort of £10 a month, which is great, or some individuals who give us sort of an amount more than that.
Donations.
Yeah, exactly.
There's another thing I've read somewhere, I think it was on your website, about secret prisons, and when you uncover them.
Yeah, so
is this worldwide?
So when we started doing the Guantanamo work, basically it was sort of an extension from our death penalty work. So we started off as a death penalty organization. Then when Guantanamo opened, everybody who was in Guantanamo was facing the death penalty. People have sort of forgotten this now, but when it opened, they were. And so we moved towards looking at defending people in Guantanamo. And it then became very quickly apparent that people who were in Guantanamo tended to have got there via a sort of rendition process, the extraordinary rendition process. So they were grabbed from wherever they started off, and they were then taken to Guantanamo. And very often before they got to Guantanamo, they went to some secret prison en route. So be that the salt pit in Afghanistan or the dark prison. One of our clients, Binyam Mohammed, was taken to a prison in Morocco where he was really horribly tortured. And it seemed as though that process involved prisoners being taken to places where there was a sort of specialism in torture and where they could be terrorized, because they knew that they were somewhere like Morocco where anything could happen, I guess. And that was definitely part of the interrogation pattern. Interestingly, the European courts just brought out a judgment a month or so ago recognizing that there was a black site in Poland, and making it very clear that it was obvious that the Polish government knew about it, and being very damning in that regard. So this information is kind of coming out now. We're doing some quite interesting accountability work actually around that. The specific case we've got is very cool. So it's kind of the perfect rendition case. So first of all, there are two guys who are Gaddafi opponents. So they're nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, but they're Gaddafi opponents. And they are in Southeast Asia. And this is in around 2004, when Tony Blair is wanting to do a deal with Gaddafi, and there's the deal in the desert and so forth. And at around that time, the CIA, with enthusiastic help from British intelligence, renders these two men together with, in one case, one of their wives who is pregnant, and one of their wives and 4 children, all of whom are under the age of 12. So they're grabbed in Southeast Asia and they're rendered to torture chambers in Libya. And later on, scroll forward to the fall of Tripoli, where the rebels storm the offices of Moussa Koussa, who is Gaddafi's chief spy, and find in the sort of smoking remains, boxes of papers. And within that, they find a letter from Sir Mark Allen, the then head of MI6, to Musa Kusa, dear Musa, as it were. So glad to hear about the safe arrival of your air cargo. I know that the technology was American, but the intelligence that allowed it all to happen was all British. And, you know, we're very delighted it all turned out so well. And so literally a smoking gun. I mean, this is the stuff that, as human rights people, we just never find this stuff. But we found it
banned. Yeah.
Right. So well, you're like, well, it was created in the first place. Why do you write a letter like that? Anyway, no doubt regretting it. But so we've got the extraordinary thing now where we're bringing cases on behalf of Mr. Belhaj and Mr. Al-Sadi. Actually, Mr. Al-Sadi is now settled with the government for a considerable amount of money. But Mr. Belhaj is still bringing his case basically because he wants an apology, and that hasn't been forthcoming. I think his was the wife who was pregnant when she was rendered, and I think she is extremely unhappy about it still. I have had 2 children. I can sympathise with that. Anyway, so that case is ongoing and is coming to trial reasonably soon. But it's an interesting case because it involves accountability not only of the security services who rendered Mr. Belhaj, but also the spooks briefed pretty quickly that they had ministerial approval for the rendition. So that then the accountability goes up the chain a bit. So you're not just talking about the Lindy Englands of the world, you know, the woman who was in Abu Ghraib. You're talking about. So anyway, we've Jack Straw is part of the litigation, and we'll see what happens with that. We're also talking to the police about prosecution in relation to the rendition, because obviously it's also illegal. So that's a very exciting piece of litigation that we're also doing on the war on terror side of it.
And for the human side of it, you mentioned earlier, is it hard for you to think, you know, these crimes these people have committed, do you still see them as a people, you know, I'm sure you do, but give them a second chance? Is that, you know, you take away the emotions, do you
mean
for the prisoners?
The clients?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think of it more around as a systemic thing. I just think that governments shouldn't kill people. I think governments shouldn't torture and render people. It doesn't really matter what they've done. I mean, obviously, it matters what they've done in the context of they need to be put on trial, and if they are guilty, they need to be put in prison. But I believe in that very strongly. And I think that as soon as you start deviating from that and you start creating secret prisons and prisons on islands where you don't have to give people lawyers, you're lost as a government. And so I see a lot of Reprieve's work as holding power to account and just saying, you know, we know how to do it. We do it this way, and you're not doing it this way, so it's going to go wrong, you know, and it does go wrong. You know, there's a reason why, you know, I'm not saying that the court system is perfect, but it's the least bad system.
Justice.
There's a reason why people have, you know, there's a reason we use it.
Yeah. And then you said you don't agree with the death penalty.
That's the next thing. So the death penalty is, I think this is some of the most awesome stuff that we're doing at the moment, actually. So the Stop Lethal Injection project.
Right.
We've been doing this for about 4 years now, and it started with, so what we do is we work with pharmaceutical companies to allow them to put distribution controls in place which stop their medicines being used by death rows in America. It's a bit complicated, but what it basically means is that lethal injection becomes impossible because the death rows in question don't have the drugs to kill people. Pharmaceutical companies are really keen on this because obviously they create medicines. I mean, I'm not saying that pharmaceutical companies are angels, but they work with healthcare professionals, they work with doctors, they work with nurses. They don't want to be associated with people dying. They want to be associated with people recovering and living because that's what doctors want to happen, you know, and also pharmaceutical companies want to happen. So, so basically, we've been working with a bunch of pharmaceutical companies to put distribution controls in place so that their drugs cannot reach execution chambers. And as a result of this, executions are down. So 24 out of 33 executing states cannot execute at the moment, either because they haven't got enough drugs or because they are tied up in litigation around drugs. In the last 4 years, Illinois, Connecticut, and Maryland have all abolished. And there are a bunch of states now that, as I say, can't execute because they haven't got the drugs. So last week, Pennsylvania put a stay in place in relation to an execution because it just didn't have the drugs to execute the person. There's also Missouri, where we were expecting a bunch of warrants to be handed down, and they didn't come down. And the reason they didn't come down is because Missouri doesn't have the drugs to kill people. And in sort of at the same time as that, very unfortunately, a bunch of states which haven't had drugs have tried mixing their own cocktails of drugs, compounding drugs which they think might kill people, which then haven't worked.
It's going to work or not.
Exactly. And so that has led to a number of botched executions. There was one in Ohio, I think,
in January. A few botched ones in the last few years, I think, where it went on for much longer than they thought. And yeah.
Correct, exactly. There was Clayton Lockett in Oklahoma in April, and then there was Joseph Wood in June in Arizona. And the Joseph Wood one was really horrible. It was an hour and 40 minutes. But Clayton Lockett was 40 minutes. You know, it's just pretty hideous stuff.
What's a time that it's supposed to be within 20 minutes? Is it all?
Well, the point is that they're not supposed to suffer at all.
They argue that they weren't suffering though in that time, that they didn't know they were past a point, didn't they?
Well, yes. The problem is, I think that the botched executions have made the public very sceptical about the myth of humane execution, such that support for the death penalty is now at its lowest in 20 years. It's 55% as opposed to 78% 20 years ago. The thing is that I'm pretty sure that lethal injections were never humane, but they appeared to be humane because one of the drugs was a paralytic, so that you couldn't see the prisoner writhing in agony as he died. And as soon as you remove that drug, you can see what's actually happening. But it feels to me as though there's some kind of sea change happening in America at the moment, which could see a move to abolition. I mean, what happens generally is that states don't go from killing people to not killing people. They go from killing people to a moratorium, so they stop executing for a bit, and then when it becomes apparent that the sky hasn't fallen in and actually the world doesn't come to an end if you stop killing people, then there's a move to abolition. And so it feels to me as though we may be approaching something along those lines.
I know you mentioned 3 states, I think Maryland and the others who have abolished it. Who decides? Is it a vote, or is it the senators, or is there a judge? It's
a good question, but the governor can.
Okay.
And that has happened a few times. There was one governor who decided on the basis of, because they have to sign the execution warrants, and
federal law,
exactly, and so they see all of the people who are being executed. And there was one guy who was a Republican actually, but who said, this is just unfair. He saw all of these things coming up. He felt that the whole thing was discriminatory, and specifically racially discriminatory. And he just said, until we can work out a better way of doing this, we're just not doing it anymore. A better way of not discriminating against people, we're just not doing it anymore. So that's one way. In California, there was a bill passed for abolition, which very unfortunately didn't quite pass, but it was like 48 to 52, and so that's another way in which it can be abolished. But basically, with all of these things, there are various things that you can do. There's sort of litigation which can sort of stop executions happening, but fundamentally, if public support falls away, it'll stop happening.
We had a question from a viewer who said there is a counter-argument that there's a common belief that execution a prisoner is cheaper than keeping them in jail for life.
Is this true? No, your view. It's a really interesting. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. This is fascinating. This whole thing. Suddenly, but also it's like questions just pop into you. Anyway, it's brilliant. No, I can see why that would be would seem to be the case, but in fact it's more expensive to kill people because, and this doesn't go down terribly well with the pro-death penalty folk, but the reason it's more expensive to kill someone is the number of appeals and so forth that are available to someone who's going to be killed, and so the amount of money that it costs the state's paying for the lawyers. So, and of course, people who are pro the death penalty say, "Oh, well, just get rid of the lawyers." Exactly. Yeah. But actually, and one of the reasons, the very persuasive reasons in California that the death penalty, that the bill nearly passed to abolish the death penalty, is that it's just costing California a fortune.
Roughly, like,
I should know.
$500,000 or $1 million? I don't know. Like,
per person. I'm pretty sure that it's over $500,000.
It's a lot of money.
Per person. And in California, there's got a huge death threat. It's hundreds of people. So you are talking about a lot of money. I mean, obviously, it also costs a lot of money to keep people in incarceration for the rest of their lives. And, when we've dealt with the death penalty, we'll need to move on to life without parole, because I think that's a hideous notion as well. But
how long do you think it will be before it's changed? There's a turn.
I think in America it could be a matter of years. We could be. I mean, I'm obviously, like, the nature of my work, I've got to be ridiculously optimistic all the time, because otherwise you'd just weep. But I think it could be a matter of years. There's the there's this constitutional challenge, which is that the death penalty can't be cruel or unusual. So the death can't be cruel or unusual. And so, bizarrely, if one can remove a bunch of states, if more states continue to abolish, so that you end up with only a few states executing, arguably that could be unusual.
Of course.
So you end up with a potential federal challenge against the death penalty.
Is legal injection the only form left of death penalty?
Very interesting. Yeah, that is a brilliant question. So yes, at the moment it's what all the states are using.
In the US?
In the US. Yeah, there are awful barbaric ways of doing it all over the other place. Yeah. But no, in the US, yes. And I think a lot of time and effort and energy has been invested in the concept of lethal injection, the concept of humane execution. As I say, I don't believe that it is humane, but so states are now talking, because of the shortage of drugs, they are talking about reverting to other methods. So they're talking about the electric chair, they're talking about the gas chamber. I think...
Hanging? They don't do that anymore, do they?
They already mentioned hanging. The firing squad they've mentioned.
What's the firing squad?
You just get a bunch of people with guns,
is it?
put someone up against the wall. And the interesting thing about that is that one of the shooters has blanks, so none of them know, none of the firing squad know who was responsible for killing the guy, or at least you always know that you might not have been. Which in and of itself, I think, is an argument against having the death penalty, because if someone needs to have, if you accept that the executioner is going to be potentially horribly traumatized by the situation, then you're just like, that's part of the problem.
Leaving it on other people, of course.
But I think that and again, this may be me being very optimistic, but I think that if the states do bring back the gas chamber, the electric chair, I think that could be the turning point towards abolition, because I think a lot of people in America will just be like, no, that's just barbaric.
Would there if they wanted to bring that back, they can just implement that, or would a referendum wouldn't be needed or anything like that? No, it's just up to the state, is it?
That is a good question. Yeah, I believe it is just up to the state. I don't think a referendum would be needed.
Is there more states that can have death penalties than don't have?
So there are 34 out of 52
that have it. Oh, that's a lot.
It is a lot. Although some of those don't
use
very much. There's Texas, and which is on one end of the spectrum. There are some states that are responsible, and indeed some counties in some states which are responsible for the vast number of the death penalties in the US.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Then I was going to ask you about the current cases you're dealing with.
So today is a good day. Well, hopefully it's going to be a good day. We're waiting to hear about the appeal case of a guy called Ahmed Zaidan. And he is in prison in the UAE. And we've got quite a few cases like this, where British tourists who have gone to Dubai or some part of the UAE and have either taken drugs with them or have purchased drugs or been caught with drugs on their person, have been arrested and tortured. And the problem is that the police in the UAE have a systemic method of torturing people, of presenting them with confessions in Arabic, which of course British tourists don't understand and can't read. They then sign it, and it's then used against them in trial. We've managed to get quite a few British tourists home, but this guy Ahmed, who's from a student from Berkshire, did sign a confession. At the moment, he went to trial We managed to get a term of years. He got 9 years instead of the death penalty, which was very positive. The police or the court refused to look into his torture, and the prosecutor appealed the sentence, asking for it to be increased. And so we should hear the result of that appeal today. Usually in the UAE, we can use political pressure and press pressure quite effectively to hopefully get people home, and we're also trying to use some of the information that we found in that place. So, for example, we did some research which seemed to show that a vast number of the people who were in prison had been tortured. Not just British tourists, but also people who were in prison from the population within the UAE. And so we're trying to use that to do some litigation work around the use of torture by the police in the UAE. It's tricky, it's an uphill battle, but hopefully at least with Mr. Zaidan we'll get some good news today.
When you say torture, what kind of forms of torture can be used? You don't have
really
to,
unpleasant,
very
unpleasant stuff. So beatings, electrocutions, quite a lot of psychological stuff of sort of you're going to be killed. There's a lot of threatening of sexual, rape and
assault.
Exactly.
And then for the people afterwards who do get released, and do you help them get back into a way of life? Is there counselling available, all these kind of type things? Is that something you help with, or is that another organisation?
Yeah, I mean, we do that with our Guantanamo clients. We've got an amazing project called Life After Guantanamo, where because the weird thing with people coming out of Guantanamo is that they literally land on the tarmac somewhere,
and
that's it. And it may not be a place where they have any family, where they speak the language,
passport,
right? Anything. So, and if it's in Europe, there is something of a safety net, but in a lot of countries, there needn't necessarily be any kind of safety net. I mean, in terms of social security and so forth. But with the guys who come back to England from the UAE or what have you, there actually are reasonably good things in place here, and generally they do have their family here, and there are some quite good NGOs and very, very good NGOs and doctors and psychologists and so forth, psychiatrists who are happy to work with them. So
there was another question. Sorry, going back to just looked at going back to prisoners. Do you have a lot of suicide attempts?
We had some in Guantanamo, which were really awful. For a long time, the only way people were leaving Guantanamo actually was if they'd killed themselves or died in prison. The reason I'm looking up is that I'm trying to remember the name. There was some extraordinary Orwellian name that was given, which was sort of deliberate terminal self-harming or something. It wasn't that, but it was along the lines of in the same way as extraordinary rendition is the phrase that they use for kidnap. There was something that made it sound as though the prisoners were just being incredibly difficult and using some form of protest by killing themselves. So in Guantanamo there have been some suicides. Usually the death penalty clients are hanging in there for, because there's a process that they're a part of, and that they have hope that they will receive a term of years and possibly be transferred back to the UK or to their country of origin. Okay,
we have another question. Okay. I think you might just have to repeat it in my ear. It's something. If someone is an ISIS member or a serial killer, if you don't believe in the death penalty or life in prison, what is the appropriate sentence for someone in ISIS or a serial killer?
Yeah. It's not that I don't believe in life in prison. It's that I don't believe in life in the concept of the automatic concept of life without parole. I think that people should absolutely be incarcerated for as long as they're a danger to society, and I think that with some serial killers, that may very well mean that they are in prison for their whole life. But I think that you have to continue to monitor that. Okay. Exactly. I think that the problem, to be really clear, the problem with life without parole is that it's being massively applied throughout America to people to whom it absolutely shouldn't be applied to. So the whole 3 strikes and you're out thing means that you can potentially be in prison. You can get life without parole for doing, admittedly, 3 things, but none of which necessarily even have to be violent. They could, it could be 3 thefts from a shop. And I think the idea that you're then in prison with no hope of ever getting out is awful for the person, but it also just means that you have a ridiculous kind of runaway prison population, which is, significantly higher than any other country in the world in terms of the American prison population. I absolutely think that if you're talking about someone who has committed a crime, whatever the crime is, they should be tried for it. And if it's a particularly terrible crime, which is obviously the one that the sort that your listener is talking about, it should be they should receive a considerable sentence, and they should be reviewed at the end of that sentence or during that sentence to see whether they remain a threat to society, and if they do, they shouldn't be released. I think prison is a very useful form of incapacitation, and I think it should absolutely be used for that.
Absolutely. Something that just came into my head: women in prisons.
Yes.
Not that. Are there any women in Guantanamo?
No.
I didn't think so. Then I can't remember that if ever I've heard of a woman who's been faced with the death penalty lately. Not in my lifetime, maybe.
There are some.
Does that happen?
We've had some who have been facing the death penalty for drug smuggling, because a lot of drug mules are women, and so in Southeast Asia and so forth. Exactly. A lot of our clients over there are women.
They're forced into it, though, aren't they? The majority of them.
Yes. And again, this is a kind of contentious area, because drug smugglers are pretty clever, right? Yeah. As in the people who oversee these operations. The people who end up being drug mules are generally not terribly clever. They probably wouldn't approach, and I don't mean any fault of modesty, but they probably wouldn't approach you, and they probably wouldn't approach me to be drug mules. So the people who do end up being drug mules, you look at the situation and you're kind of like, well, that was really stupid, the thing that you did. You were told that this person, you were told to meet someone in this country and to take a suitcase for him, and that he loved you and he was going to marry you, and quite clearly any person with a sense of a hedgehog would realize that that was rubbish. But that is kind of the reason that those people are recruited, and so it isn't their fault, but they generally are.
What about the 2 girls in Spain who ended up in, was it Peru or Argentina? Yeah. Was it Argentina? Yeah. And I think one of them has now got released, but hopefully has.
Yeah, we weren't involved in those cases, actually.
Melissa and I can't remember the other girl's name. Yeah.
I mean, the whole drugs situation is really interesting, and we do have one project which we are doing around this, which is around the European countries' counter-narcotics aid to places like Pakistan and Iran, because, for example, France currently gives a vast amount of money to Iran in the kind of war on drugs, counter-narcotics thing. And the problem with that is that what then happens is that Iran has, as it were, so simplistically, France buys a bunch of sniffer dogs for Iran. Iran uses those sniffer dogs to find a bunch of people with drugs on them, and Iran then hangs them all from a crane. So we are trying to bring pressure to bear on France, also the UK, which is giving a bunch of counter-narcotics money to Pakistan, which is a country which technically it's not executing people at the moment, but it has a very large death row, and saying not you mustn't give money to these countries for counter-narcotics purposes, but you have to attach strings to that money and say that if you catch people who have drugs on them, you shouldn't be executing them, because otherwise, Europe, which is supposed to be an abolitionist, anti-death penalty bunch, are actually facilitating and enabling, and arguably even kind of enthusiastically suggesting that all these drug mules be executed, which is just not, first of all, I disagree with it because it involves the death penalty in the first place, but it's also just not working. What it means is that a bunch of people get executed, and all the people who are running the people who get executed carry on doing it and just find more people who they feed into the mill. So it's just not an effective, I think it's pretty well accepted that the war on drugs is not a terribly effective war.
Going back to it again, sorry, I know we spoke a lot about America. Does India have a death penalty, or have they got rid of it? I think they got rid of it, did they? I'm not sure. Like, even I'm looking at other countries now. I know you spoke a bit about Asia. What other countries?
India does, and they very, very rarely execute. But I believe that we don't do work in India. But I believe that the recent terror attack, they were looking at death penalties for people who were involved in that. Countries that we're involved in are Pakistan, as I mentioned, which is interesting because it has things like, it has the death penalty for blasphemy, and so we're involved in a couple of cases of people who, and most of the people in question are mentally ill because they are, for example, suggesting that they're the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay.
And so therefore,
but it's mad they don't help them. They just,
well, therefore that's blasphemy, and therefore they're on death row. And obviously it's deeply horrible, because if you're mentally ill and then put on death row, you don't tend to get very much better.
And do these people get placed somewhere? Let's just say if you get them removed from Pakistan, would they move to another country? Is that something you can do? Get them placed in another country with the Pakistan? No.
Oh no, only if they are not Pakistani in the first place. So one of the people whom we're acting for, Mohammed Asghar, is half British, and used to live in Britain, and then went to Pakistan. And actually, what he did was he printed business cards with his name on, and then underneath that he wrote PBUH, which stands for Peace Be Upon Him, which should only be said about the Prophet Muhammad. And so, because of those business cards, he was accused of blasphemy and then put in prison. And the difficult thing about this sort of work is that it's very dangerous for our lawyers, because there are a lot of people in Pakistan who are very pro the death penalty for blasphemy, and so it means that our lawyers have to have 24-hour protection and so forth, so that they don't get shot by someone who thinks that they are doing something wrong by defending these people.
I know one of my friends, I said I was meeting you today, said last night, is there any research behind basically the family who, if someone's been murdered, I think it was in the States, they mentioned a case, and the family go and watch, is there any research that shows that helps them get past it, that justice has been done?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I find one of the hardest bits of my job is talking to family members of people who've been killed, particularly if their children have been killed. I've got 2 very young children, and I just go to pieces, really. But anyway, so that's my definite weak spot. We had an amazing woman who came and spoke to Reprieve, who was the mother of a girl who had been killed. And it was classic, awful kind of home invasion, man who'd been stalking her. She was 18, very beautiful, and was sexually assaulted and then killed. And she was saying that she was opposed to the death penalty, actually not because she didn't want the guy who had killed her child to die, but because she said that as soon as the death penalty was on the table, there was just this media frenzy which had been agony for her. She said, had it been a life without parole situation or what have you, she didn't think that there would have been the interviews and the harassment that she got as a family member of someone who was involved in a death penalty case, which was interesting. I mean, and the guy hasn't been executed yet. I do know a friend of mine a friend of a friend actually wrote a book about someone whom she had been writing to in prison, and it was particularly tragic. He was executed, and then the father of one of his victims committed suicide because the execution of this guy hadn't brought him the peace that he thought it was going to. So there is definitely some evidence that victims' families are not assisted by the death penalty either. I expect there are probably quite a lot of victims' families out there who would say that they felt a lot better when the guy who killed their loved one was executed. And I mean this sincerely, with the greatest of respect, I don't think that means that justice. There should be an execution process, because I think that as soon as you bring someone into that situation, if one of my children were killed and someone asked me what should happen to them, I like to think I would say that they shouldn't be executed, but I just think that you go into you don't think you're not the person who should be making that decision, I think is the point, and that's why we have a justice system. That's why we don't have, ravening mobs who just lynch people.
The UK stopped it in the 60s, was it? And then it was abolished in the 90s? Was that it? Or
no, it's just been 50 years. So it was 50 years.
It's been abolished 50 years.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, they
yeah,
got
it was
it
the anniversary.
60s, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, and they stopped it. I was just reading it this morning.
Yeah, and and I think we're a long way away from it. That, there's the thing in the UK when anything hideous happens, we always get calls from Jeremy Kyle saying, can you come on and discuss whether we should bring back the death penalty? I think we're quite a long way away from it.
Absolutely.
I hope so.
I don't think that there's any chance of that being reversed. Is there any other work that you would do that you wanted to
think that pretty much. I think that pretty much covers it. Yeah.
Have you been to Guantanamo?
I haven't. One of the things that I don't know. I guess I would quite like to go, partly because I think it would make me a slightly better ambassador for Reprieve, because a lot of people ask me that question. Basically, one can only go if one's security cleared, and you can get security cleared if you're going to be a lawyer and you're American, or if you're a journalist who gets security cleared. And again, most of those are American, although some of the Brits have international press are also invited, but then those people aren't security cleared, but they're just invited to go on sort of press visits.
Bit of a tough question. Would you attend an execution if you were invited?
No.
I don't think I'd like to be.
Clive, my boss, has attended, I think, 6, because he's lost 6 of his clients, which is a pretty good, astounding record given the number of cases he's had. A lot more, yeah. Yeah, he's won over 300.
Oh wow.
But I think he's been properly traumatized by that, because you've got a relationship with that person by then. You've been working with them for years, and actually to see someone killed, I think is it's not something I would want.
No, that's what I was going to say. Did I write down 65 British prisoners of Clive Stafford Smith? No, or Guantanamo. Guantanamo. Yeah. Oh,
65 from Guantanamo, and
GB. That's why.
Yeah. There you go. Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo Bay.
And over 300 death row dudes.
That's amazing.
He's also working. Actually, here's what I'll finish with. He's also working on a case at the moment, which I think will be absolutely awesome. He's become obsessed, which is wonderful, but he's working on this guy's case called Krishna Maharaj, and he was a really interesting guy because, for all sorts of reasons, but in part, he was quite rich. And I know that sounds really weird, but I think a lot of people on death row weren't, and weren't kind of middle class, affluent, successful. He was a successful businessman. He owned some race horses. He was one of he was a bit like some of our donors, I guess.
Okay.
And so he did a completely hopeless thing, which is what a lot of innocent people do, and he just kind of trusted the system. And so he didn't have an alibi, but obviously you kind of don't if you are innocent very often. Yeah. And he did put up a defense, but he just I think it wasn't a terrifically thorough one, because I think he just believed that he hadn't done it and therefore he'd be found not guilty. Anyway, Clive has been working away on this and has ascertained that the people who actually committed the crime were various Medellin cartel members. And so, God help us, Clive has been running around Medellin in South America, speaking to cartel members and getting depositions and witness statements and God knows what else to prove that Chris is innocent. And that trial is coming up at the end of this year, and he will have been in prison for 27 years. And his wife has stuck by him for all of that time.
That's a third of your life.
Yeah, he's 80, and he's an old man. He's been in prison for almost 30 years for a crime he didn't commit, and hopefully this year he'll get out because of Clive's work.
His wife is still alive. Yeah.
His wife is alive and standing by him.
It's
really incredible stuff.
We have a viewer question, if that's okay. How many people do you estimate on death row are there because of wrongful convictions?
Well, that's interesting. I think there was a thing done by the Innocence Project, which said 1 in 20.
Okay.
Which is
5%.
Yeah. It may. I don't know. I don't know whether it's higher than that or not. I think it was 1. I'm just realizing. Part of me is thinking 1 in 20, and the other part is thinking 1 in 4, which are two very different numbers. And I should know. I should know which one. Yeah. I think it isn't. I don't think it's 25%, because that would be very high.
You mentioned the Innocence Project there.
In America, there's a very strong and very good project which specifically works to find innocent people.
Is it government funded now?
No, I don't think so.
Not a lot of them are.
To be fair, if you're working in, like, it's not very easy getting money in this area at all, but if you are working in this area, one of the easier places to find money is for innocent people, because, you know, as it were, even Republicans don't think innocent people should be killed. So I'm not saying anyone has an easy time raising money on death penalty stuff, but I think that innocent stuff is easier. And I think what they do is absolutely great, because actually the thing that convinces people that the death penalty is a bad idea is innocence. It's one of the reasons that the Maharaj case is very exciting. There was a case called Troy Davis a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, which was huge because he was just patently innocent and he was still killed. And actually it's generally that which swings people, I think. So the Innocence Project's work is very important. Obviously, we also do guilty people. But,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's it. I don't think there's any more questions, is there? No, okay,
Super.
that's
thank
brilliant.
You so
thank
much.
you very much. I was going to say thank you so much to Claire from Reprieve, sorry, I knew I was going to say, from Reprieve for coming in today, and thank you for watching and for your great questions. We will be back live at 3 o'clock today, London time, with Ben Swan from America, having a discussion about the legalization of cannabis, so we hope you can stay tuned for that. See you later.